My mother-in-law invited my own mother to my baby's monthly celebration without telling me. She planned it all behind my back, in my apartment. What happened next made me realize I'd been living in someone else's fantasy of my life. Hi, I'm Brielle, and I'm 28 years old. This story is about boundaries, respect, and the moment I finally stood up for my family's peace. Let me take you back to where it all began. I met my husband Jasper 3 years ago at a coffee shop near downtown Portland. He was reading a book about sustainable architecture while nursing his third espresso of the day, and I was grading papers from my third grade class at the corner table. When he accidentally knocked over my red pen collection, we both laughed, and somehow that clumsy moment turned into our first conversation about dreams, teaching, and building things that last. Jasper was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. He listened when I talked about my students, brought me soup when I was sick, and had this gentle way of making even the most stressful days feel manageable. We moved in together after 8 months, got engaged the following spring, and married in a small ceremony at my parents' backyard. Everything felt perfect, like we were building this beautiful, quiet life together. When I first met his mother, Cordelia, she seemed lovely. She brought homemade lasagna to our apartment, complimented my teaching career, and told Jasper how lucky he was to find someone like me. She had this warm smile and spoke about family traditions with such passion that I actually felt grateful to be welcomed into their close-knit dynamic. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how she talked about family traditions as if they were non-negotiable laws rather than suggestions. The first few months of marriage were blissful. Jasper and I fell into this comfortable routine where we'd both come home exhausted from work, cook dinner together, and spend our evenings talking about everything and nothing. We'd curl up on our small couch, watching old movies or reading books side by side, and I remember thinking this was what happiness felt like. Simple, quiet, and ours. Everything changed when I got pregnant. Suddenly, Cordelia's visits became more frequent. She'd show up with baby books, nursery decorating ideas, and very strong opinions about everything from cribs to feeding schedules. At first, I appreciated the help. Being a first-time mother felt overwhelming, and having someone who'd raised 3 children offer guidance seemed like a blessing. But slowly, her suggestions started feeling less like advice and more like commands. "You'll want to set up the nursery exactly like I did for Jasper," she'd say, rearranging the baby clothes I'd carefully organized. "And make sure you register for the same brand of bottles I used. Trust me, I know what works." When I mentioned wanting to try breastfeeding, she'd shake her head and launch into stories about how formula was so much more convenient and allowed fathers to bond with babies too. Every conversation felt like a subtle undermining of my instincts as a mother. The warning signs were there, but I kept making excuses. When she rearranged our kitchen cabinets during one visit, I told myself she was just trying to help. When she criticized the pediatrician we'd chosen because he wasn't the same doctor who'd treated Jasper as a baby, I convinced myself she was sharing valuable experience. When she started referring to our baby as her grandbaby instead of your baby in conversations with friends, I tried to believe it was just grandmother excitement. Jasper noticed my growing discomfort but seemed caught between 2 women he loved. "She means well," he'd say after each incident. "This is just how she shows love. She's excited about becoming a grandmother." I wanted to believe him because fighting with family felt exhausting, and I was already dealing with morning sickness, work stress, and all the physical changes of pregnancy. It was easier to smile and nod than to start a conflict that might divide our family before our baby even arrived. Our son Xavier was born on a rainy Tuesday in March, and those first few weeks were the most beautiful and exhausting of my life. Jasper took 2 weeks off work, and we existed in this precious bubble of sleepless nights, tiny fingers, and overwhelming love. We'd spend hours just watching Xavier sleep, marveling at how perfect and small he was. I remember thinking this was exactly what I'd dreamed family life would feel like, intimate, peaceful, and full of wonder. But that bubble burst the moment Cordelia arrived for her first visit. She walked into our apartment with armfuls of gifts, took Xavier from my arms before I could even say hello, and immediately started giving us a running commentary on everything we were doing wrong. "He's too warm in that outfit," she announced, stripping him down despite my protests. "And you're holding him too much. You'll spoil him." She stayed for 6 hours that first day, reorganizing our diaper-changing station and critiquing my breastfeeding technique while I sat there feeling like a guest in my own home. That's when the monthly celebrations started. Cordelia announced that she'd be hosting a mensiversary party every month to celebrate Xavier's growth. "It's a family tradition," she declared, though Jasper later admitted she'd never done this for any of her other grandchildren. "I'll handle all the planning and decorating. You just focus on taking care of the baby." It sounded reasonable at the time, maybe even helpful. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and the idea of someone else handling party planning seemed like a gift. The first mensiversary party was held at our apartment without much consultation. Cordelia arrived 2 hours early with decorations, food, and a guest list I hadn't approved. She'd invited Jasper's entire extended family, some of their family friends I'd barely met, and somehow forgot to tell me that his ex-girlfriend's mother would be attending because she was practically family. I spent the entire afternoon feeling like I was hosting a stranger's party in my own living room while random relatives held my 1-month-old baby and offered unsolicited parenting advice. "Isn't this wonderful?" Cordelia kept saying, taking photos of Xavier with various guests while I sat in the corner trying to pump milk and feeling completely invisible in my own home. "He's so social already. Just like his daddy was at this age." Every compliment about Xavier somehow became a compliment about Jasper's childhood, as if I'd contributed nothing to our son's existence except a place for him to grow. The second month was worse. This time, Cordelia didn't even ask permission before inviting people. She just showed up with the same crowd, plus a few additional relatives who'd heard about the cute monthly tradition. Our small apartment felt claustrophobic with 15 adults drinking wine and talking loudly while Xavier tried to nap. When I suggested maybe keeping future celebrations smaller, Cordelia looked at me like I'd suggested canceling Christmas. "But family is so important," she said, her voice taking on that particular tone mothers-in-law use when they want to make you feel selfish. "Xavier needs to know his extended family. You wouldn't want him growing up isolated, would you?" The implication was clear. Wanting privacy made me a bad mother who was depriving her child of family connection. By the third month, I was dreading these celebrations more than root canals. Jasper and I were both working full-time again, and our weekends were precious opportunities to rest, bond with Xavier, and just exist as a family of 3. But every month, our home was invaded by this circus of relatives who treated our apartment like a party venue and Xavier like a prop in their family photo collection. I started dropping hints to Jasper about how exhausting these monthly parties were becoming. "Maybe we could alternate between our place and your mom's?" I suggested. "Or skip a month here and there?" But Jasper seemed oblivious to my growing frustration. "Mom just loves Xavier so much," he'd say. "And look how happy it makes her to plan these things. What's the harm in letting her celebrate our son?" The harm was that I was losing my sense of home. Every month, strangers would comment on our furniture, use our bathroom, eat our food, and leave messes for us to clean up after working 60-hour weeks. The harm was that Xavier was becoming overstimulated by loud adults and disrupted sleep schedules right when we were trying to establish routines. The harm was that I felt like a supporting character in my own life, watching someone else direct the story of my family. But I kept quiet because confronting Cordelia felt impossible. She had this way of making every criticism sound like concern and every boundary sound like selfishness. When I mentioned that Xavier seemed fussy after parties, she'd say, "Oh, babies love stimulation. You don't want him to be antisocial." When I suggested keeping celebrations shorter, she'd respond with, "But family time is so precious. You'll understand when you're a grandmother someday." The fourth month brought a new level of intrusion. Cordelia started arriving hours before the party to help set up, which really meant completely rearranging our living room, kitchen, and even our bedroom to accommodate her vision of the perfect celebration. She'd move our personal photos to make room for her decorations, rearrange our furniture without asking, and go through our pantry to see what food we had available for her to incorporate into her menu. "I hope you don't mind, but I used your good wine glasses," she said during one setup session, holding up the crystal glasses Jasper and I had received as wedding gifts and saved for special occasions. "They're so much nicer than those plastic ones you usually use for parties." We didn't usually use plastic ones because we didn't usually throw parties. These monthly invasions were the only parties happening in our home, and somehow our own belongings were being treated like props for her event planning. During that fourth celebration, I watched from the kitchen as Cordelia posed for photos with Xavier, directing other family members into group shots and posting everything on social media with captions like, "Family time with my precious grandson," and "Monthly tradition with my favorite little man." In every single photo, she was front and center, holding Xavier like he belonged to her while Jasper and I appeared in the background looking tired and awkward. That night, after everyone left and we were cleaning up the inevitable mess, I finally tried to have a serious conversation with Jasper about boundaries. "I need you to understand how overwhelming these parties are becoming," I said, scraping cake frosting off our coffee table while he picked up discarded paper plates. "I work all week, come home exhausted, and then spend my weekend hosting parties I didn't plan with people I barely know." Jasper looked genuinely surprised by my frustration. "I thought you liked the parties," he said. "Mom always says how grateful you seem for all her help with celebrating Xavier." This was my first clue that Cordelia had been presenting my polite tolerance as enthusiastic gratitude, telling Jasper I was happy with arrangements that were actually making me miserable. "I'm trying to be grateful," I explained, "but I also need some weekends that are just ours. Just us, as a family. Xavier is 4 months old. He doesn't need monthly parties with wine and loud conversation. He needs routine, quiet time, and parents who aren't stressed about hosting events every few weeks." I could hear the desperation in my own voice, the plea for Jasper to choose our little family's peace over his mother's social calendar. Jasper promised to talk to his mother about scaling back the celebrations, but nothing changed. If anything, the 5th-month party was bigger and more elaborate than ever. Cordelia had decided to implement a theme, Little Prince, and decorated our entire apartment in blue and gold, complete with a crown-shaped cake and tiny royal outfits for Xavier to wear during photos. She'd invited even more people than usual and had apparently been planning this party for weeks without consulting either of us. "Surprise," she announced when we walked into our own living room and found it transformed into someone else's vision of a royal celebration. "I thought Xavier deserved a really special 5-month celebration. Wait until you see the photos we're going to get." She immediately whisked Xavier away to dress him in a miniature prince costume while I stood there feeling like an intruder in my own home. That party lasted nearly 7 hours. 7 hours of our small apartment being overrun by relatives taking photos, eating elaborate food Cordelia had prepared in our kitchen, and celebrating our son like he was their communal property rather than our child. I spent most of the afternoon hiding in our bedroom, claiming I had a headache, because I couldn't bear to watch another minute of this performance where everyone else got to enjoy my baby while I felt like hired help. After that party, I started having full-blown anxiety attacks thinking about the 6th-month celebration. I'd lie awake at night imagining our apartment being invaded again, strangers handling Xavier, Cordelia directing photo shoots and posting social media content about her family traditions. I felt trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape because saying no to family celebrations would make me look like the villain who was depriving everyone of joy. But the 6th-month party never happened the way Cordelia planned it, because that's when she crossed the line that finally woke me up from my people-pleasing coma. 3 days before Xavier's 6-month mensiversary, my phone rang while I was at work. It was my mother, Penelope, calling from her home in Seattle. "Hi honey," she said, and I could hear excitement in her voice. "I just got the strangest call from Jasper's mother. She invited me to fly down for Xavier's monthly party this weekend. She said it would be a surprise for you and that I shouldn't mention it because you'd be so overwhelmed with joy that you might spoil the surprise by planning something yourself." I felt my blood pressure spike as I processed what my mother was telling me. Cordelia had called my mother, who lived 3 states away, to invite her to a party I didn't know about, and asked her to keep it secret from me. She'd gone behind my back to orchestrate some kind of surprise family reunion without my knowledge or consent, in my own home, during what was supposed to be a quiet weekend when Jasper and I had finally planned to have some alone time with Xavier. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my hands started shaking, "I had no idea about any of this. Jasper's mother didn't ask me before inviting you, and honestly, this weekend isn't good for hosting. We both have work projects due Monday, and Xavier has been going through a sleep regression. We were planning to have a quiet weekend at home." My mother's voice immediately shifted from excitement to concern. "Oh honey, I'm so sorry." She made it sound like this was something you'd planned together as a surprise for Jasper. "She said you'd been talking about how much you missed me and wanted me to be part of Xavier's monthly celebrations. I already booked a flight because she said it was important that I be there Saturday morning." That's when I realized the full scope of what Cordelia had done. She hadn't just invited my mother without asking me. She'd lied to my mother about my involvement, manipulated her into making travel plans, and created a situation where I'd look terrible if I canceled because my own mother had already spent money on plane tickets to attend a party I didn't want and hadn't planned. I spent the rest of that workday seething with rage I'd been suppressing for months. Cordelia had crossed every boundary I had, turned my mother into an unwitting accomplice in her manipulation, and put me in an impossible position where canceling the party would disappoint my mother and make me look like an ungrateful daughter-in-law. But letting it happen would mean accepting that I had no control over my own home, my own family, or my own life. That evening, I tried to explain the situation to Jasper, hoping he'd finally understand how far his mother's behavior had escalated. "She called my mother behind my back," I said, pacing around our bedroom while Xavier napped in his crib. "She lied to her about my involvement and asked her to keep secrets from me. This isn't about celebrating Xavier anymore. This is about control. But Jasper seemed more concerned about avoiding family drama than addressing the violation of our privacy. Look, your mom is already coming, and she's excited to see Xavier, he said. What's the harm in just letting this one party happen? We can talk to my mother about boundaries after this weekend. He seemed incapable of understanding that every time we just let this one thing happen, we were teaching Cordelia that her behavior had no consequences. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and realizing I had reached my breaking point. For months, I'd been sacrificing my comfort, my peace, and my sense of home to avoid conflict with a woman who clearly had no intention of respecting my feelings or boundaries. I'd been so focused on being the perfect daughter-in-law that I'd forgotten to be a strong mother and wife. The next morning, while Jasper was at work and Xavier was having his morning nap, I called my mother back. Mom, I need to tell you the truth about this weekend, I said. Jasper's mother has been throwing these monthly parties without really consulting me, and I've been feeling overwhelmed by them for months. I love that you want to celebrate Xavier, but I need this weekend to be different. My mother listened while I explained the full situation, the monthly invasions, the boundary violations, the way Cordelia had been manipulating family dynamics to get her way. Honey, my mother said gently, why didn't you tell me how you were feeling? I would never want to be part of something that was making you uncomfortable in your own home. Together, we came up with a plan. My mother would still fly down as scheduled, but instead of attending Cordelia's party, she'd spend the weekend having quiet family time with just Jasper, Xavier, and me. We'd go for walks, have intimate conversations, and let her bond with her grandson in a peaceful environment rather than a chaotic party atmosphere. And I would handle the conversation with Cordelia myself. Friday evening, I called Cordelia to inform her that my mother wouldn't be attending Saturday's party and that we'd be keeping the celebration small and private. I appreciate all the planning you've done, I said, choosing my words carefully, but I need to start setting some boundaries around these monthly celebrations. Going forward, I'd like to plan them myself or at least be fully involved in all the decisions. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. When Cordelia finally spoke, her voice had lost all its usual warmth. I don't understand, she said. Your mother seemed so excited when I talked to her. And I've already prepared food for 15 people. Are you really going to cancel Xavier's party at the last minute because you want to control everything? There it was, the accusation I'd been dreading. By setting boundaries, I was being controlling. By wanting to make decisions about celebrations in my own home, I was being unreasonable. By asking to be consulted before my own mother was invited to travel across the country, I was being difficult. I'm not canceling Xavier's celebration, I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. I'm just changing the format to something that works better for our family right now. You're welcome to join us for a quiet afternoon with my mother, but we won't be hosting a big party this month. Cordelia's response revealed everything I needed to know about her real motivations. This isn't about what's best for Xavier, she snapped. This is about you wanting to keep him away from family who love him. You're being selfish, and frankly, I'm disappointed in how you're handling motherhood. That accusation hit like a physical blow. After months of trying to be accommodating, grateful, and flexible, I was being told that wanting peace in my own home made me a bad mother. I was being criticized for prioritizing my son's need for routine and quiet over his grandmother's need for social media content and party planning. But instead of backing down like I had every other time, something inside me finally snapped into place. Cordelia, I said, and my voice came out stronger than it had in months, I am Xavier's mother. I work full-time, I care for him every night, and I know what he needs better than anyone else. What he needs right now is a peaceful home environment and parents who aren't stressed out from hosting parties every few weeks. The conversation ended with Cordelia hanging up on me, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I had finally spoken up for my family's needs instead of managing everyone else's emotions. Saturday morning, my mother arrived, and we had the most beautiful, peaceful day we'd had since Xavier was born. We took him to the park, had lunch at a quiet cafe, and spent the afternoon just talking while he played on his blanket in our living room. No decorations, no crowd, no social media photos, just 3 generations of family enjoying each other's company in exactly the way I'd been craving. This is so much better than a big party, my mother said, watching Xavier grab at colorful toys while we sat on the floor beside him. He's so much more relaxed, and so are you. I can actually have a conversation with you instead of shouting over a crowd. Jasper seemed surprised by how much he enjoyed the quiet celebration too. Without the pressure of entertaining relatives and managing party logistics, he was able to focus completely on Xavier and actually be present for the milestone we were celebrating. I forgot how nice it is when it's just us, he admitted while we gave Xavier his evening bath together. But our peaceful weekend was shattered Sunday morning when Cordelia showed up unannounced at our apartment. She used the key Jasper had given her for emergencies and let herself in while we were having breakfast, walking into our kitchen like she owned the place and immediately launching into a tirade about how disappointed she was in our selfish behavior. "I can't believe you kept Xavier's own grandmother away from his celebration," she said, not even acknowledging my mother, who was sitting at our table holding Xavier. "I've been planning these parties for months, and now you want to destroy our family tradition because you're jealous of the attention he gets from people who love him." I felt my protective instincts kick in as I watched her storm around our kitchen, ranting about traditions and family loyalty while completely ignoring the fact that she'd broken into our home to continue an argument from 2 days earlier. This wasn't about Xavier's celebration anymore. This was about power, control, and her inability to accept that I had the right to make decisions about my own family. "Cordelia," I said, standing up and moving closer to my mother and Xavier, "I need you to stop. You let yourself into our apartment without permission, you're yelling in front of my baby, and you're being incredibly rude to my mother, who is a guest in our home." But she wasn't finished. "Your mother wouldn't even be here if I hadn't invited her," she continued, her voice getting louder and more agitated. "I was trying to do something nice for your family, and this is how you repay me? By excluding me from my own grandson's celebration?" That's when my mother, who had been quietly observing this whole scene while holding Xavier, spoke up in her calm but firm voice. "Cordelia, I think you need to take a step back. This is Brielle and Jasper's home, and they have every right to decide how they want to celebrate their son. I'm grateful to be here, but I'm here because my daughter invited me, not because you orchestrated some surprise behind her back." The look on Cordelia's face when my mother defended my boundaries was priceless. She clearly hadn't expected any pushback from the other grandmother, and suddenly she was faced with the reality that her manipulation hadn't worked the way she'd planned. Jasper, who had been frozen in shock since his mother barged in, finally found his voice. "Mom, you can't just let yourself into our apartment like this. And you can't yell at Brielle for wanting to spend a quiet weekend with her own mother. This has gotten way out of hand." But Cordelia wasn't ready to back down. "Fine," she said, her voice dripping with martyrdom, "if you don't want family involvement in Xavier's life, then maybe I just won't come around anymore. Maybe I'll let you raise him in isolation without any support from people who actually care about family traditions." The manipulation was so obvious it was almost laughable. She was threatening to withdraw her support, which had never felt supportive, unless we allowed her to continue controlling our family celebrations. She was trying to make us choose between having her in our lives and having boundaries in our own home. That's when I realized I was done negotiating with someone who saw my needs as obstacles to overcome rather than preferences to respect. "Cordelia," I said, looking her directly in the eyes, "if you can't respect our boundaries, then maybe some distance would be good for everyone. Xavier will always be your grandson, and you'll always be welcome in his life, but not if you can't treat his parents with basic respect." The silence that followed was intense. Cordelia stared at me like she couldn't believe I'd actually stood up to her. Jasper looked nervous about the family drama he'd been avoiding for months, and my mother nodded approvingly while bouncing Xavier gently in her arms. "You'll regret this," Cordelia finally said, grabbing her purse and heading toward our door. "When Xavier is older and asks why he doesn't know his grandmother's side of the family, you'll have to explain that you chose control over family connection." She slammed the door behind her, leaving our apartment feeling suddenly peaceful despite the emotional chaos she'd just created. In the days that followed, I expected to feel guilty about the confrontation. I'd spent months avoiding conflict with Cordelia, so standing up to her so directly felt like a major shift in family dynamics. But instead of guilt, I felt relief. For the first time since Xavier was born, I felt like I was actually parenting my own child instead of managing someone else's vision of how my family should operate. Jasper needed time to process what had happened, but gradually he began to understand how his mother's behavior had been affecting me. "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten," he said a few days after the confrontation. "I thought you were just stressed about new mom stuff, not that you felt like you had no control in your own home." We spent several long conversations talking about boundaries, family expectations, and what we wanted our life to look like as Xavier grew up. Jasper admitted that he'd been avoiding conflict with his mother because confrontation made him uncomfortable, but he was starting to see how his avoidance had forced me to deal with all the emotional labor of managing her intrusions. "I want our home to feel peaceful," he said. "I want Xavier to grow up seeing parents who make decisions together and protect our family's well-being. If that means disappointing my mother sometimes, then that's what we'll have to do." Cordelia didn't contact us for 3 weeks after the confrontation, which gave us time to establish new routines and boundaries without her constant presence. We celebrated Xavier's 7-month milestone with just the three of us, taking him to the beach for his first experience with sand and ocean waves. It was simple, intimate, and exactly what I'd been craving, a celebration that focused on Xavier's development rather than adult socializing. When Cordelia finally did reach out, it was through a text message to Jasper asking if she could visit the following weekend. No mention of monthly parties, no assumptions about planning celebrations, just a simple request to spend time with her grandson. It felt like a small victory in establishing new patterns of communication. That visit went surprisingly well. Cordelia came over for a few hours on Saturday afternoon, brought a small gift for Xavier, and spent time playing with him and having normal conversations with us about his development. She didn't rearrange our furniture, didn't criticize our parenting choices, and didn't suggest any elaborate celebration plans. It felt like visiting with a grandmother rather than hosting a party planner. "He's gotten so big," she said, watching Xavier crawl across our living room floor. "And he seems so happy and content. You're doing a wonderful job with him." It was the first compliment she'd given me about my parenting that didn't come with suggestions for improvement or comparisons to how she'd raised Jasper. We still have monthly celebrations for Xavier's milestones, but they look completely different now. Sometimes it's just the three of us going out for ice cream or taking him to a new playground. Sometimes we invite 1 or 2 family members for a quiet dinner. Sometimes we skip the formal celebration altogether and just acknowledge the milestone with photos and a special bedtime story. Cordelia joins us for some celebrations and respectfully declines others. She's learned to ask before planning anything and to accept our decisions about what works for our family schedule. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and we still have occasional tensions about boundaries, but the dynamic has fundamentally shifted from her directing our family life to her participating in it. Looking back, I realize that those monthly party battles weren't really about celebrations at all. They were about respect, autonomy, and the right to make decisions about my own family. Cordelia wasn't wrong to want to celebrate Xavier and be involved in his life, but she was wrong to assume that her desires automatically took precedence over our needs as his parents. The experience taught me that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's essential for protecting the peace and well-being of your family. When you become a parent, your first responsibility is to create a stable, loving environment for your child, not to manage everyone else's expectations about what that should look like. I also learned that avoiding conflict doesn't actually prevent conflict, it just postpones it until the situation becomes unbearable. If I'd spoken up about my discomfort with the monthly parties earlier, we might have found a compromise that worked for everyone without reaching that explosive confrontation. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts as a mother. When something feels wrong in your family dynamic, it probably is wrong, regardless of how other people try to minimize or rationalize the behavior. Your feelings about what happens in your home and to your child are valid, and you have the right to advocate for what you believe is best for your family. Xavier is 10 months old now, and I can honestly say that our family life feels authentic and peaceful in ways I'd stopped believing were possible during those chaotic months of party invasions. He's growing up in a home where decisions are made collaboratively, boundaries are respected, and celebrations happen because we choose them, not because they're imposed on us. When people ask me about dealing with difficult in-laws, I tell them this: your child needs parents who feel confident and peaceful in their own home more than they need extended family members who refuse to respect boundaries. Love doesn't mean accepting behavior that makes you uncomfortable, and setting limits doesn't mean you're ungrateful or controlling. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stand up and say, "This isn't working for us, and we need to find a better way." It might be uncomfortable in the moment, but the long-term benefits of living authentically in your own life are worth every difficult conversation you have to get there. Today, when Cordelia visits, she knocks first. She asks before rearranging anything. She celebrates Xavier without turning him into a prop for her social media fantasies. And most importantly, she treats Jasper and me like the parents we are, not like supporting characters in her vision of family life. It took standing up to her completely to earn her respect, which says something about the dynamics that had developed over those first few months of Xavier's life. But I'm grateful we found a way forward that allows Xavier to have a relationship with his grandmother while still preserving our family's autonomy and peace. If you're dealing with boundary violations from family members, remember this: you're not responsible for managing other people's emotions about your decisions. You're responsible for creating the kind of family life you want your children to remember, and sometimes that means disappointing people who refuse to respect your choices. The most important lesson I learned through this whole experience is that being a good parent sometimes means being willing to be seen as a difficult person by others. Your child's well-being is more important than your reputation as someone who never rocks the boat. Stand up for your family's peace, even when it's uncomfortable, because that's what real love looks like in action.